Dark corners hold the stories others would rather erase. Mine lingers there, half remembered, half forbidden. I was the child of a legend, the wife kept under watch, and the voice pressed into silence. But tonight, I open the forgotten box, and I let its secrets breathe. This is my candlelight confession, where the glow of a single flame unmasks the truths that history tried to bury. The world may turn away, but the candle gives light to the truth. My father's name entered every room before I did, a herald with polished boots and a grin too wide to be refused. I loved him for it. I resented him for it. I learned to stand in the wake of his applause, as a small boat steadies itself on another ship's great swell. I remember the year the rooms changed their temperature, 1896, and time itself grew brittle. We were travelling, as we often did, shifting between rented rooms in Europe and letters forwarded across an ocean. There, among trunks lined with lavender sachets and sheet music bound in blue ribbon, news arrived like cold water tossed across the bed. My sister Susie gone, snatched in a season when a young woman's dresses ought to be lengthened, not her absence. That word, gone, punctured our family like a pin through silk. Father stopped performing for a while. Even silence bore his signature then. Mother's hands, once steady as a metronome, trembled when they laced my gloves. Grief is an untidy tutor. It taught me the sound of my own breath when the house slept. It taught me that a song, if sung with the throat alone, is a pretty thing, but if sung with the chambers of the heart broken and rearranged, it can be a cathedral. I practiced scales in small European rooms where the plaster flaked and the neighbours listened through the wall, imagining I was famous already. I wasn't. Not yet. But I learned how to send a note to the back row and make it bloom. We came to Florence in a season of cypresses and sorrow. The city felt like a violin tuned to dusk. Every cobblestone sounded against the heel. Mother's cough had become a metronome of worry, an uninvited rhythm that touched every hour. In the villa above the city, light fell in pale sheets across the tiled floor. I practiced softly, so as not to disturb her, shaping arias to fit the measured distance between her breath and mine. Father tried jokes. Little domestic pageants played at the breakfast table, but even his brightest coin could not buy back anyone's health. He watched us like a sentry who knows the invading army is not outside the gate, but already in the walls. Fame is a marvellous lantern. It glows warmly, it dazzles strangers, yet it does not heat the rooms where your loved ones sleep. I learned that in Florence. When we walked in the streets, men tipped their hats to him, not because he was tall, but because he was him. Women leaned into their friends' parasols to whisper, "You know who that is." And beside him, I felt tall and small in the same instant. My own name, Clara, was treated the way one handles a parcel labelled fragile, careful, curious, a little uncertain what was inside. I wished to open myself and say, there is a voice, there is a woman, there is a stack of unwritten evenings waiting to be lived. But polite society appreciates packages more than the contents. It loves the bow and fears the breaking of string. I sang for guests in salons where the windows were dressed in lace and the air in rumour. People asked me how it felt to be his daughter, as if I had chosen it. I answered gently. It felt like being born beneath a tall bell tower, where the bells mark every hour and everything else must learn to speak between them. When I found my interval, those small moments when no bell was sounding, I hurried to fill them with song. I kept a small book then, ivory covers, gilt edges, in which I wrote questions instead of prayers. What is a daughter if not a shadow? What is a shadow when it decides to step out of line? The pages still smell of the orange blossoms I pressed between them. I wrote about the stage, the way it felt like a second spine slipping into the body, holding me upright in a way ordinary life never did. And I wrote about love, which I had not yet learned could be dressed as duty and still be called love. 1904 came to us like a slow curtain, heavier every day. The doctor spoke in careful syllables. Father stared at the floor before he dared to look at Mother's face. A daughter knows when a season is ending. The hallway seems longer between rooms, and the glasses cling to the tray as if they understand that sound matters. The evening we lost her, Florence observed us in its patient way. The city did not stop. The baker still counted his coins, the bells still tolled the hour. But within our rooms, the air turned to glass, and every breath felt like a small, exquisite shattering. My father, always public, bowed to a grief too private for any stage. He folded into a chair, and I learned that night that even heroes have backs that can break. I sang nothing the next day. I sang nothing for many days. A woman cannot sing when her chest is full of stones. Yet there was a whisper inside me that would not be quieted. If I do not lift my voice, I will never be able to lift this weight. That is how the first part of my life ended, not with applause, but with the soft closing of a door. And if the door was my childhood, then everything after was the hallway, dimly lit, carrying me toward choices I could not yet see. Transition. I promised myself that when I next sang for a room, it would be for my own reasons. I promised myself that love, when it came, would be my choice, not a consolation prize offered to a grieving house. But promises made to one's future are the easiest to break, especially when the future arrives dressed as kindness. If reputation is a lace collar, then scandal is the thread that pulls and pulls, until what once framed you elegantly begins to gape. My first engagement unfolded in a city crowded with polished shoes and sly newspapers. He was well-spoken, well-positioned, and well-approved by those who counted approval like money. He whispered that my voice filled a room like moonlight. I told him not to compare me to weather. He laughed and changed the subject. We announced it quietly, as if secrecy could bless it. Nothing stays quiet when a famous name sits at your breakfast table. The invitations were not yet printed when tongues got to work. They asked the usual questions. Would I keep singing? Would I step back, as a woman should, leaving the stage for a drawing room and a nursery? The editorials were polite daggers. They dressed their barbs in lace, a lady ought to, but a cut is a cut, even when perfumed. Father tried to stand between me and the world, but the world simply walked around him and knocked on my door. I should have known then that love which requires so much explanation is no friend to a singer. Yet I wanted ordinary days, as a widow wants a second chance at first love. I tried to shape myself into a promise someone else had written. The arguments did not bang doors, they tightened silences. We disagreed about the stage and what it asked of a woman. He said an audience was a kind of theft, that every eye stole a small piece of the woman it adored. I said applause could be a gift when given by decent hands. He said decent hands could also become fists. He was not cruel, he was careful. But careful men can erect cages so polished you cannot see the bars until you stumble against them. I broke the engagement after a fortnight of dreams that woke me breathless and strangely voiceless. I wrote a letter with a steady hand and a broken heart. The notice in the paper was a thief of adjectives. Miss C, noted for her musical promise, will not marry after all. The line was so thin it barely cast a shadow, and yet all day I felt newly overexposed. Women I barely knew patted my wrist as if I were a frightened pet bird escaped from its ribbon. They meant well. Pity always does. The second engagement had less lace and more fire. He admired my singing, really admired it, understood the labour stitched into each performance. He said art should not be folded and placed in a drawer at marriage. He said so many things that made me feel seen. I found myself smiling without thinking, a rare and dangerous ease. We were engaged before the year had entirely turned. Father watched us the way a sea captain watches the horizon on a fair day, pleased, but measuring wind. Then came the rumours, the ones you do not expect to belong to you until they are printed next to your name. An angry letter from someone else's mother. A whisper that my future mother-in-law found me too public, too American in my frankness, that my father's fireworks would set their hushed parlour ablaze. Other stories, small but corrosive, found us in the corners of rooms, that a woman who sings for supper cannot also be trusted to stir the soup. How neatly people sort women into cupboards. When the quarrel came, it came over breakfast. The egg cooled, the tea went bitter. Our voices kept very still so that the housemaids would not be forced to overhear. He loved me. No one lied about that. He wanted me. No one lied about that either. But he needed me to be less public, less visible, less certain. I tried, God help me, I tried to make myself smaller without losing my lungs. It is difficult to sing like that. The breath has nowhere to go. We parted with tears that embarrassed even the handkerchief. The headline that followed was mercilessly clever. I will not repeat it. The world will always find a rhyme for woman and wound if it tries. Father pretended to read the paper for the jokes and skipped the rest, but I saw his hand tighten and his smile falter in the middle of a story that wasn't funny at all. He never said "I told you so." He wore his worry kinder than that. And then, a winter evening that smelled of varnish and lamp oil. A recital in a city whose streets wore snow like lace cuffs. I had been invited not to sing, but to listen. Perhaps that is why fate chose that night. It loves us best when we are not looking it directly in the face. He entered with quiet confidence, as if the stage had been expecting him all afternoon. Not tall enough to intimidate, not slight enough to dismiss, shaped like a question to which the room suddenly longed for an answer. The pianist's name rolled through the audience in a shy current, foreign vowels melting on American tongues. He bowed without flourish, sat as if listening for a secret within the instrument, and then he began. The first chord was not loud, it was true. It rang the way a bell rings when the ringer's hand is tender but certain. He played as if each note had been alive before he touched it, and would go on living after he lifted his fingers. I felt something turn over in me, not a heart, but a key. He did not look at the audience the way some men do, as a mirror to admire themselves in. He looked past us, into the same future I had promised myself and then betrayed. In that moment, the hall was no longer a hall. It was a door. After, in the crowded green room where perfume and critique mingle, we were introduced. Our conversation began in the language art chooses when it is shy, the weather of the piece, the tempo's choice, the way silence frames the sound. He asked about my voice, not my father. I answered about my craft, not my name. If you have ever spoken with someone who keeps your secrets without being asked, you know the look that passes between two strangers. It resembles recognition. It also resembles danger. He spoke of discipline as if it were a country with borders one must defend. I spoke of freedom as if it were a room within that country, a room with open windows. He smiled at that, genuine, not for display. He did not flatter, he observed. He did not promise, he suggested. And yet, even as I felt the ground tilt toward him, I felt another gravity pull in the opposite direction, the memory of those tidy cages built by careful men. We met again, in parlours where music does what it does best, reminds the soul of its own proportions. He asked when I felt most at ease on a stage. I told him the instant before the first note, when everything I have practiced hovers like a bird, deciding whether to fly. He nodded, as if that was the only correct answer. He asked what I feared. I said, being loved for the wrong reasons. He did not say never. He said, then we must be very clear about our reasons. Something in me wanted to believe him with both hands. Something in me, older and more bruised, folded its arms. There were whispers, of course. A woman cannot cross a ballroom with a handsome musician without a trail being drawn behind her. But these whispers had a different tone. Not the pity that follows a broken engagement, not the hunger of gossip fresh from a kitchen door. This was speculation with a sigh hidden inside it. People love a new chapter when they have helped to close the last one. Father watched us from a friendly distance, as if keeping a map tucked in his vest pocket, just in case we got lost. I will not pretend that everything was simple. It never is when art meets art, when habits meet hope. He loved discipline. I loved the door left ajar. He valued silence around the work. I had learned to craft my whole life around the moments when I was allowed to make a sound. We were not opposites. We were neighbours, peering over the shared fence of our calling. The world outside our carefully measured rooms had its own plans. Storms gathering far from our candlelight, maps being redrawn by hands I could not see. But that is another corridor, and we are not yet at its window. For now, picture a winter street, horses shifting in their tack, a woman tightening her cloak, and a man whose hands had just proven that thunder can be coaxed from ivory. Picture a name that would soon be attached to mine, promising a kind of safety I did not yet know how to receive. Picture a door, partly open, and two people standing on either side of it, both believing the other has the key. Some doors are not meant to be opened or closed. They are meant to be held, gently, while life passes through. Love, when it finally chose me, did not arrive with roses or gilded carriages. It arrived in the shape of a piano, mahogany, shining, tempered by years of practice and sweat, and the man whose hands could coax storms and lullabies from its keys. Osip Gavrilovich. His name carried a foreign cadence, one that seemed both exotic and stern on American tongues. I first thought of him as a storm contained. His discipline frightened me, not because it was cruel, but because it was absolute. Every hour of his day seemed portioned like medicine, measured, swallowed, endured. And yet, when he played, that same discipline broke open into wildness. Each chord leapt like a bird freed of its cage. I watched him in those hours and thought, perhaps he understands what I've been trying to become. Our meetings grew into courtship, though we did not call it that. He would invite me to rehearsals, and I would linger in the wings, my gloved fingers curled tightly together, willing my heart not to beat so loudly. Afterward, we walked in streets dusted with snow, the gas lamps turning the cobblestones into small, glittering stages. He spoke of Europe, of Berlin and Vienna, where music was not pastime but currency, traded in households like bread and wine. He told me that my voice, if trained with the right severity, could rival the great singers who filled those gilded halls. I listened with both pride and fear. Pride, because at last someone saw me as more than Mark Twain's daughter, more than a gossip column's subject. Fear, because Osip believed in discipline as though it were faith, and I had spent my whole life struggling against walls built of expectation. My father approved, or at least he said little to the contrary. By then, his own health had begun to fray, and I think he longed to see me steadied by someone else's arm. He admired Osip's seriousness, his refusal to bow to frivolity. "A man with no time for nonsense," father called him. But there was worry too. I saw it in the way he hesitated before leaving a room where Osip and I sat. He knew I was trading one shadow for another. Osip courted me with music rather than flowers. He would seat me in a parlour, turn the lamp low and play until the hour was too late to be polite. My heart, traitorous as ever, leaned toward him like a moth to a flame. And yet, a whisper followed me into every rehearsal, every conversation. What will remain of me if I choose him? He asked for my hand, not with poetry but with certainty. "Clara," he said one evening, "we must marry. It is the only reasonable outcome." It was not the language of a lover, but of a commander, and I found myself nodding before my breath had caught. Perhaps I mistook certainty for devotion. Perhaps I mistook order for safety. The engagement was announced. Newspapers approved. Friends smiled with relief, as though my broken past could be erased by a well-placed ring. I smiled too, though in the quiet corners of the house, when the lamps had been extinguished, I would rest my hand upon my throat and ask whether it was still mine. I did not yet know that the promise of safety can be the most gilded of cages. Marriage is spoken of as a union, but it can also be a division, of one life into two roles, of one woman into halves she must spend the rest of her days reconciling. Our wedding in 1909 was celebrated as if it were a treaty signed between nations. The daughter of Mark Twain, the brilliance of Gavrilovich, society applauded as though art itself had been wedded. But within the walls of our new home, applause faded quickly. Osip was kind, yes, but his kindness wore the sternness of duty. He saw life as a series of scales to be practiced, corrected, perfected. I, however, longed for the pauses between the notes, the breath, the laughter, the silence that made the music worth hearing. My singing became a point of dispute. He insisted I devote myself with greater discipline, as he had to the piano. Hours of practice, strict teachers, endless critique. He wanted me to abandon the warmth of song for the architecture of it. And yet, when I faltered, he grew cold, as though my imperfection were a betrayal of his own devotion. Worse still, there were days when he insisted I abandon my ambitions altogether. "A wife," he said once, "cannot belong to both the stage and the home." His words struck like winter wind against glass. I wanted to shout that my voice was not a guest in my body, it was its very tenant. But I swallowed my protest, because to speak it aloud felt like defiance too heavy for the room. And there was father, slipping from us with each passing year. His laughter dimmed, his steps slowed. In those hours of decline, I wanted nothing more than to sit at his side, to remind him that his shadow did not swallow me whole, that I still carried his humour and his fire. But Ossip required my presence elsewhere, in study and rehearsals, in the relentless march toward a perfection that was never mine to claim. I learned quickly that marriage is not only about love, it is about control and how it is wielded. Ossip did not strike, did not rage. He simply folded the world into the shape he desired and expected me to fit within it. And the tragedy was that I tried. I bent myself note by note, gesture by gesture, until I could barely recall the shape I had once been. But the voice, the voice does not vanish so easily. It slipped out at times, rebellious, filling a parlour with a hymn when no one had asked. It rose in my throat when grief for father threatened to drown me. It was the one part of me that refused to be trained into silence. The years between 1910 and 1914 became a ledger of loss and compromise. My mother gone, my father fading, my marriage tightening like a corset drawn one string too far, and me singing in secret, dreaming of stages I might never stand upon again. They say a woman learns herself in marriage, but I believe a woman learns the measure of her chains. And once you know their weight, you must ask whether you can carry them forever, or whether you must someday set them down, even at terrible cost. I was not yet ready to choose. But choices have a way of arriving uninvited, like storms that will not wait for permission to break. Death does not come all at once. It creeps like evening, slowly, softly, until you find yourself in a darkness you did not notice arriving. My father's final years were this twilight, and I stood within it, torn between my role as daughter and my role as wife. The world mourned him before he was gone. Newspapers chronicled every cough, every decline, as though grief itself was a public performance. Strangers mailed letters thick with condolences, while his heart still beat beneath our roof. I wanted to guard him, to shield him from the indignity of being mourned alive. But Ossip believed duty to him came second to duty to music. "You cannot nurse forever," he would say, "but you can sing forever if you practice now." His logic was a hammer striking at my tender ribs. I visited father as often as I could, stealing hours from my husband's schedules. He would sit in his worn armchair, white hair blazing like a crown, eyes dimming yet still sharp when they met mine. "Clara, girl," he would whisper, "don't let them put your fire out. You're your mother's daughter, but also your own." His hand, frail and trembling, would close over mine, and I would feel the weight of a legacy that was both blessing and chain. In his final months, he wrote letters to friends, letters to the world, letters to us. But one evening, when the lamps burned low, he beckoned me closer. "Take this," he said, pressing folded pages into my palm. "Not for Ossip, not for the world, for you." I never showed them to anyone. They were a father's last confession to a daughter, his regrets, his fears, his hope that I might someday sing freely, not for society, not for marriage, not even for him, but for myself. When the day of his passing came, the world thundered with grief. Headlines screamed, tributes poured in from kings and commoners alike, the bells tolled as if tolling for a nation, not a man. But in the house, silence ruled. I did not weep at first. My tears would not obey me. I only felt a hollowing, as if half my voice had been stolen. The world looked to me as though I might carry his mantle, as though his shadow could simply pass from father to daughter. But I was already entangled in another shadow, the marriage I had chosen, the discipline that bound me like iron laces around my chest. Ossip did not understand grief as something tender and slow. He believed in work as remedy, in rehearsal as cure. "The world expects strength from you, Clara," he insisted. "Your father's death will not excuse weakness." Weakness. That word clanged against my heart like a cracked bell. To him, sorrow was indulgence. To me, it was survival. And so I learned to weep behind closed doors, my sobs muffled into pillows, my voice cracked not from practice but from grief. I was his wife. I was my father's daughter. But inside, I was also a prisoner. Of expectation, of marriage, of grief too large to carry alone. And yet, somewhere in the distance, I felt the whisper of a stage I had not yet reached, a promise my father's last words still kept alive within me. How long can a woman live divided? Between love and loss, duty and desire, silence and song. I did not know then. I only knew that the walls were closing in, and my voice was searching for a way out. After Father was gone, the world expected me to become him. To lecture, to publish, to embody the wit and fire that had filled halls from Boston to Berlin. But I was not him. I was myself, and my voice was meant not for pulpits or lecture halls, but for song. I began to sing again, not timidly, not in corners, but upon stages lit so brightly they erased all shadows. My performances were met with applause, but applause is a double-edged blade. Some clapped because they believed in me, others clapped because I carried his name. And I never knew which hand struck which notes. Ossip alternated between pride and command. Some nights he watched me with admiration, as though my singing were a compliment to his own art. Other nights he reminded me that a wife's ambitions must never surpass her husband's. "Your stage must not eclipse mine," he warned, and the words settled like chains across my shoulders. Yet cracks began to appear in the illusion of our life. I saw women around me carving small freedoms, writing, painting, performing without apology. Their lives were not perfect, but they were theirs. And I began to imagine a Clara who was not always explained as daughter or wife, but as a woman entire. Still, I was afraid. Afraid of scandal, of whispers, of becoming once again a name in the paper with adjectives stolen from me. But fear has its limit, and mine was approaching. The voice within me, trained, restrained, scolded, praised, was beginning to demand more than practice. It was demanding truth. And truth, when it comes, is never gentle. There are endings, and then there are pauses mistaken for endings. My life has known both. I was a daughter of one of the most famous men to walk the earth, and yet even as his laughter echoes in libraries and lecture halls, mine has been a quieter existence, measured, restrained, sometimes stifled. Marriage promised me devotion, but it also demanded surrender. I was loved, yes, but often on the condition that I remained less than I truly was. And still I sang. Perhaps not as freely as the young girl who once whispered arias to the plaster walls of rented rooms in Europe, but enough to remind myself I was alive. Soft, solitary piano notes drift in, like memories slipping through an open window. I think often of Father's final words to me, his warning not to let the fire go out. I have carried those words like an ember cupped in my palm. Sometimes it burned me. Sometimes it kept me warm. Always it reminded me that silence is a choice, not a destiny. And yet, I never wholly escaped the shadows. Society still introduced me as Mark Twain's daughter. Critics still measured me against my husband. The world applauded me, yes, but always with an asterisk. The daughter of, the wife of, never simply Clara. I have come to believe that some lives are not about triumph, but testimony. Mine was not the tale of a woman who broke free, but of one who struggled daily against her chains, leaving behind scratches, whispers, and songs that proved she lived. Perhaps that is its own form of defiance, that despite grief, despite control, despite the long shadow of a father and the firm grip of a husband, I remained a voice. The story does not end neatly. Life rarely does. My days have been filled with compromises, yet also with beauty. Concerts that lifted strangers to their feet. Evenings when Ossip's sternness softened into wonder. Quiet moments when I felt my father's laughter stir in my throat. I am Clara Clemens. A daughter. A wife. A singer. A woman unfinished. If my life is a song, then it ends not with resolution, but with a note that lingers in the air, unanswered, waiting for someone else to carry it forward. And that is my confession. And so, our flame fades on Clara Clemens, the daughter who could not outrun her father's shadow, the wife who bore the weight of a marriage, the singer who dared to hold her voice in a world that asked her to hush. Hers was a song of quiet rebellion, not of triumph, yet it lingers still. Here at my Candlelight confession, we breathe life into voices nearly lost, the forgotten, the restrained, the restless hearts that history tried to leave in silence. Thank you for sharing your time with me. If Clara's story has stirred something within you, know that there are many more waiting in the dark, ready to be heard. Until we meet again, let the flame keep watch, and may your own truth never be extinguished. Good night.